Before we begin tonight's peaceful journey, I want you to forget everything you know about America. Forget the towering cities. Forget the busy highways. Forget the endless noise of modern life. Instead, imagine a land where the forests seemed endless, where a single candle was precious, where a family might spend an entire day without seeing another soul. Tonight, there will be no great battles, no famous presidents, no revolutions, only the quiet rhythm of ordinary people trying to build a simple life on the edge of an immense wilderness. So, make yourself comfortable, allow your breathing to slow, and together, let us quietly step back more than 3 centuries to a forgotten morning. On the American frontier, the night still held the land in its quiet embrace. Above the endless forests of colonial America, thousands of stars remained visible in the dark sky. There were no city lights to hide them, no distant factories. The night still held the land in its quiet embrace. Above the endless forests of colonial America, thousands of stars remained visible in the dark sky. There were no city lights to hide them, no distant factories, no passing trains, only silence and the occasional call of an owl somewhere beyond the trees. The forest itself seemed alive. Ancient oak trees stood like silent guardians. Tall white pines reached toward the heavens, their branches gently moving with the cool night breeze. A thin layer of mist rested across the ground, covering the roots of the trees like a soft white blanket. Somewhere nearby, a narrow stream quietly carried cold mountain water through smooth stones, producing a gentle sound that almost resembled whispered conversation. The air smelled of damp earth, fresh pine needles, old wood, and smoke that had escaped from a lonely chimney hours before. Hidden among these endless woods stood a single log cabin. It was not impressive. It was not large. It had been built by hands that had never expected perfection. Each log had been cut with an axe. Each beam had been lifted by exhausted shoulders. Each stone beneath the fireplace had been carried from the nearby river. The cabin leaned ever so slightly to one side, as though years of wind had slowly encouraged it to bow toward the forest. Its roof was covered with rough wooden shingles. Some had already begun to darken with age. Others had been replaced after winter storms. Nothing about the house was beautiful by the standards of great cities. Yet to the family who lived inside, it was safety. It was warmth. It was home. Inside, darkness still filled the small room. Only a faint orange glow remained beneath the ashes inside the stone hearth. The fire had burned all night, not to provide comfort, but to prevent the bitter cold from creeping inside before dawn. Near the fireplace slept the family dog. The night still held the land in its quiet embrace. Above the endless forests of colonial America, thousands of stars remained visible in the dark sky. There were no city lights to hide them, no distant factories. The night still held the land in its quiet embrace. Above the endless forests of colonial America, thousands of stars remained visible in the dark sky. There were no city lights to hide them, no distant factories, no passing trains, only silence and the occasional call of an owl somewhere beyond the trees. The forest itself seemed alive. Ancient oak trees stood like silent guardians. Tall white pines reached toward the heavens, their branches gently moving with the cool night breeze. A thin layer of mist rested across the ground, covering the roots of the trees like a soft white blanket. Somewhere nearby, a narrow stream quietly carried cold mountain water through smooth stones, producing a gentle sound that almost resembled whispered conversation. The air smelled of damp earth, fresh pine needles, old wood, and smoke that had escaped from a lonely chimney hours before. Hidden among these endless woods stood a single log cabin. It was not impressive. It was not large. It had been built by hands that had never expected perfection. Each log had been cut with an axe. Each beam had been lifted by exhausted shoulders. Each stone beneath the fireplace had been carried from the nearby river. The cabin leaned ever so slightly to one side, as though years of wind had slowly encouraged it to bow toward the forest. Its roof was covered with rough wooden shingles. Some had already begun to darken with age. Others had been replaced after winter storms. Nothing about the house was beautiful by the standards of great cities. Yet to the family who lived inside, it was safety. It was warmth. It was home. Inside, darkness still filled the small room. Only a faint orange glow remained beneath the ashes inside the stone hearth. The fire had burned all night, not to provide comfort, but to prevent the bitter cold from creeping inside before dawn. Near the fireplace slept the family dog. Its ears twitched now and then as dreams quietly passed through its sleeping mind. Against one wall stood a rough wooden table. Its surface carried countless marks left behind by years of daily life. Knife cuts, burn marks, tiny scratches from bowls and wooden spoons. Nothing had ever been polished. Nothing had ever been replaced. Every object inside the cabin existed because someone had made it. A chair carved by the father. A stool built by an older son. Shelves fastened together with handmade wooden pegs. Iron hooks forged by a traveling blacksmith many years before. Above the table hung several bundles of dried herbs. Sage, thyme, mint. Their gentle scent mixed with the smell of smoke drifting through the room. In one corner stood a simple spinning wheel. Beside it rested unfinished wool, waiting to become thread before winter arrived. Nothing inside the cabin served only decoration. Every possession had a purpose. Every tool represented many hours of difficult labor. Every piece of cloth represented months of patient work. Outside, the eastern horizon slowly began changing. Black became deep blue. Deep blue became gray. Gray slowly welcomed the first hint of gold. The new day was arriving, without hurry, without ceremony, exactly as it had done for countless generations before. No bell announced the morning. No clock struck the hour. Nature alone decided when another day should begin. And in that forgotten corner of early America, another ordinary day quietly waited to unfold. The first rays of sunlight had not yet reached the forest floor. Only the highest branches of the towering oak trees had begun to glow with a faint golden color, while everything below remained wrapped in cool blue shadows. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fireplace slowly spread through the single room. The fire did not roar. It whispered. Tiny flames carefully climbed over dry pieces of oak wood, producing gentle crackling sounds that blended perfectly with the peaceful silence of the morning. The woman of the house sat quietly beside the hearth. She had awakened long before anyone else, not because she wished to, but because life on the frontier rarely allowed anyone the luxury of sleeping late. She pulled a simple wool shawl around her shoulders. Its edges had become worn after many winters. Several careful stitches could be seen where small tears had once appeared. Nothing was ever thrown away. Every piece of cloth was repaired again and again until it could no longer serve its purpose. Beside the fireplace rested a heavy iron kettle. Its black surface had become smooth after years of daily use. The woman slowly poured fresh water into the kettle using a wooden bucket that her husband had carved many years before. Every movement was quiet. Every action seemed practiced. There was no need to hurry. There was nowhere to hurry. Outside, the forest still belonged to the night. The family depended on these slow mornings. They were perhaps the only peaceful moments before an entire day of difficult labor. She reached toward a small wooden shelf. Upon it rested several small cloth bags. Each contained dried herbs collected during the previous summer. Chamomile, mint, wild raspberry leaves. She selected only a small handful. Nothing could be wasted. The herbs gently floated upon the warming water. Soon, a delicate fragrance filled the cabin. It mixed with the smell of burning oak, old timber, fresh earth, and the faint scent of dried lavender hanging from the ceiling beams. Nearby, one of the children quietly turned beneath a thick wool blanket, still asleep, dreaming perhaps of nothing more exciting than chasing chickens through the yard or helping his father gather firewood. Simple dreams, simple lives. The father slowly opened his eyes. He did not immediately rise. Instead, he listened. This had become his habit over many years. He listened to the fire, to the wind outside, to the distant birds, to the silence itself. Silence often told a careful listener many things. If the wind blew strongly from the north, winter might arrive earlier than expected. If the birds remained unusually quiet, perhaps a storm approached. If the dog suddenly barked before sunrise, someone or something might be walking through the forest. But this morning, everything felt peaceful. The dog remained asleep. The birds sang softly. The wind barely touched the trees. It promised nothing extraordinary. Only another ordinary day. The father finally stood. His joints complained quietly after years of chopping wood, lifting stones, building fences, and clearing fields. Every movement reminded him that the frontier demanded strength from every person who wished to survive. He folded his blanket carefully. Even blankets were valuable. A torn blanket during winter could mean many cold nights. The youngest daughter slowly rubbed her eyes. She smiled sleepily toward her mother. No words were spoken. None were needed. The quiet morning itself seemed to encourage silence. The woman poured warm herbal tea into rough clay cups. Each cup had been shaped by a traveling potter many years before. Tiny cracks decorated their surfaces. Yet they still served the family every single morning. Breakfast remained modest. Dark rye bread, a small piece of smoked venison left from the previous autumn, a little butter carefully stored in a cool cellar. Nothing more. No sweet pastries, no rich feasts, no overflowing tables. Only enough food to prepare everyone for another long day. Outside, the first rays of sunlight finally reached the clearing around the cabin. Golden light slowly touched the rough wooden walls. Tiny drops of dew sparkled upon the grass. The chickens began scratching the earth. A horse quietly shook its mane inside the stable. Somewhere far beyond the trees, a woodpecker began tapping patiently against an old oak trunk. The forest was waking, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, one quiet sound at a time. And so, another peaceful morning began, exactly as it had yesterday, and exactly as it would tomorrow. The father slowly opened his eyes. He did not immediately rise. Instead, he listened. This had become his habit over many years. He listened to the fire, to the wind outside, to the distant birds, to the silence itself. Silence often told a careful listener many things. If the wind blew strongly from the north, winter might arrive earlier than expected. If the birds remained unusually quiet, perhaps a storm approached. If the dogs suddenly barked before sunrise, someone or something might be walking through the forest. But this morning, everything felt peaceful. The dog remained asleep. The birds sang softly. The wind barely touched the trees. It promised nothing extraordinary, only another ordinary day. The father finally stood. His joints complained quietly after years of chopping wood, lifting stones, building fences, and clearing fields. Every movement reminded him that the frontier demanded strength from every person who wished to survive. He folded his blanket carefully. Even blankets were valuable. A torn blanket during winter could mean many cold nights. The youngest daughter slowly rubbed her eyes. She smiled sleepily toward her mother. No words were spoken. None were needed. The quiet morning itself seemed to encourage silence. The woman poured warm herbal tea into rough clay cups. Each cup had been shaped by a traveling potter many years before. Tiny cracks decorated their surfaces, yet they still served the family every single morning. Breakfast remained modest. Dark rye bread, a small piece of smoked venison left from the previous autumn, a little butter carefully stored in a cool cellar. Nothing more. No sweet pastries, no rich feasts, no overflowing tables, only enough food to prepare everyone for another long day. Outside, the first rays of sunlight finally reached the clearing around the cabin. Golden light slowly touched the rough wooden walls. Tiny drops of dew sparkled upon the grass. The chickens began scratching the earth. A horse quietly shook its mane inside the stable. Somewhere far beyond the trees, a woodpecker began tapping patiently against an old oak trunk. The forest was waking. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently. One quiet sound at a time. And so, another peaceful morning began. Exactly as it had yesterday, and exactly as it would tomorrow. The youngest boy climbed onto a small wooden stool. His feet barely touched the floor. He watched his father spread butter across the warm bread with complete fascination. Perhaps, one day, he would perform the very same task for his own children. Life upon the frontier often passed quietly from one generation to the next, not through grand speeches, but through ordinary mornings exactly like this one. The little girl smiled as her mother handed her a small clay cup filled with warm herbal tea. She wrapped both hands around it. The cup felt warm against her cold fingers. Outside, a curious chicken wandered through the open doorway. No one seemed surprised. The family dog lifted its head for only a brief moment before deciding the chicken posed no threat whatsoever. It settled back beside the fire with a long, contented sigh. The father quietly thanked God for the food before them. No long prayer, only a few simple words spoken with sincere gratitude. The family bowed their heads. Silence filled the room. Even the children remained still. For families living in this wilderness, every meal was a blessing. Every peaceful morning was a gift. Breakfast passed slowly. There was no rush, no appointment waiting in town, no crowded streets beyond the door. Only fields, forests, animals, and another long day of honest work. When the last crumbs had disappeared from the table, the mother carefully folded the linen cloth once again. The remaining bread would be saved for later. Nothing would be left exposed. Nothing would be wasted. Outside, the forest had fully awakened. Squirrels darted across fallen branches. Songbirds filled the air with gentle melodies. Far above the trees, a hawk circled silently against the brightening sky. The day had truly begun, and beyond the quiet walls of the little cabin, the endless American wilderness patiently waited. The simple breakfast had come to an end. The last crumbs of dark rye bread disappeared from the wooden table, and the warm clay cups were carefully stacked beside the stone hearth. No one stood up immediately. There was no reason to rush. The quiet stillness inside the cabin lingered for another few peaceful moments. The fire continued its gentle crackling. Outside, the forest waited patiently beneath the soft morning sun. The father slowly reached for his well-worn leather boots. The thick soles had been repaired many times over the years. Each stitch told the story of another season spent walking through rocky streams, muddy fields, and endless woodland paths. New boots were difficult to obtain. Old boots simply learned to last longer. Nearby, hanging from two sturdy wooden pegs, rested a broad-brimmed felt hat and a heavy wool coat. The cold mornings of early spring still carried a sharp chill. Even after sunrise, the damp forest air could bite at exposed hands and faces. The father quietly slipped the hat onto his head. Then he reached for the old iron axe leaning against the cabin wall. Its wooden handle had become smooth after years of steady use. Generations before him had trusted similar tools. Nothing about it was beautiful. It was simply dependable. The eldest son watched carefully. He had watched this same routine almost every morning since he was old enough to remember. One day, the axe would become his responsibility. But not today. Today, he would simply carry the smaller hatchet hanging beside the doorway. The boy proudly lifted it with both hands. It still felt surprisingly heavy. His father smiled gently. Not because the boy looked strong, but because every father quietly hoped his children would someday learn the patient skills needed to survive this vast wilderness. Before opening the cabin door, the father paused. He listened once again. Only birds, only wind, only silence. Satisfied, he slowly pulled open the heavy wooden door. Cool morning air drifted inside the cabin. It carried the scent of damp moss, fresh pine, fallen leaves, and rich, black earth still wet from the night's dew. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Even the children seemed to admire the peaceful beauty waiting beyond the doorway. Outside, the clearing glistened beneath thousands of tiny drops of morning dew. Each blade of grass sparkled as sunlight slowly climbed higher above the trees. A small rabbit darted quietly across the edge of the clearing before disappearing beneath a thick patch of ferns. High above, a pair of blue jays called to one another from opposite branches. Farther away, almost hidden by the forest itself, came the steady tapping of a woodpecker searching patiently for insects beneath ancient bark. The father stepped onto the narrow dirt path leading into the woods. The boy followed only a few careful steps behind. Neither hurried. The forest rewarded patience. Every fallen branch, every strange sound, every hidden root beneath the leaves demanded careful attention. They walked beneath enormous oak trees whose branches stretched so wide that patches of blue sky appeared only in small fragments overhead. Massive white pines stood silently among them. Some trees had already witnessed centuries before the first European settlers ever arrived upon these shores. The forest seemed timeless, almost sacred. Tiny shafts of sunlight slipped through the branches, illuminating drifting clouds of morning mist that still floated between the trunks. Spider webs shimmered with tiny beads of dew. Small squirrels raced along fallen logs before vanishing into the undergrowth. Somewhere nearby, a red fox watched quietly from behind a cluster of bushes. It had no interest in the travelers. It simply observed, just as the forest observed everyone who entered it. The father finally stopped beside a towering dead oak. Its bark had begun peeling away years earlier. The great tree no longer produced leaves. Its long life had quietly come to an end. Yet even in death, it remained useful. Dead trees burned more cleanly than fresh wood. Their timber split more easily. Their branches warmed families through long winter nights. The father gently rested one hand upon the rough bark, almost as if thanking the old tree for one final gift. Only then did he slowly raise the axe. The first swing echoed softly through the silent forest, not as a violent interruption, but almost like another natural sound joining the birds, the breeze, and the quiet heartbeat of the wilderness itself. The sound of the axe faded gently into the forest. For a few quiet moments, nothing moved except the drifting mist that curled lazily between the towering oak trees. The father lowered the axe and rested both hands upon its smooth wooden handle. He was never in a hurry. Woodcutting was not simply about strength. It was about patience. A careless woodsman often returned home injured. A patient woodsman returned home safely. The young boy stood beside his father, holding the small hatchet against his shoulder. His eyes remained fixed upon the old oak tree. To him, every swing of the axe seemed powerful. Every falling wood chip seemed exciting. Yet his father noticed something entirely different. He watched how the tree responded, how the grain opened, how the wood split, how the trunk carried its own quiet story. "Never fight the tree," he said softly. "Listen to it." The boy looked up with quiet curiosity. His father smiled. "Every tree wishes to fall in its own direction. You simply help it." Those words remained floating gently in the cool morning air. Perhaps they were meant for the tree. Or perhaps they were meant for life itself. Another careful swing, then another. The rhythm never changed. Strike. Pause. Listen. Strike again. The forest slowly accepted the sound. Nearby birds did not fly away. A squirrel continued searching beneath fallen leaves. Even the breeze seemed unwilling to disturb the peaceful work. Sunlight slowly reached farther beneath the forest canopy. Golden beams slipped between ancient branches, lighting patches of soft green moss growing upon old stones. Tiny insects drifted through the warm rays like little specks of floating dust. The boy wandered only a few steps away. His father had taught him never to leave the path completely. The forest could appear friendly, yet it demanded respect. He knelt beside an enormous fallen log. Its surface had become covered with thick emerald moss. Tiny mushrooms grew from cracks in the old wood. Small beetles disappeared beneath loose bark as soon as they sensed movement. Itself, life continued everywhere, even inside things that appeared dead. The boy carefully picked up a smooth acorn, then another. He placed them inside a small linen pouch hanging from his belt. Perhaps they would become toys. Perhaps they would simply be forgotten. Children rarely needed expensive things to remain happy. The father continued chopping. Finally, after many patient blows, a deep crack echoed through the woodland. The great oak slowly leaned, not suddenly, not violently, almost gracefully. Branches whispered against neighboring trees. Leaves trembled softly. Birds lifted into the sky. Then, with one final sigh of ancient timber, the old tree settled gently upon the forest floor. Silence returned almost immediately. The father removed his hat. For just a brief moment, not because anyone expected it, not because any rule demanded it, but because he believed every old tree deserved a little respect after standing faithfully for so many years. The boy quietly copied him. Together they stood without speaking. Only the wind spoke now. It wandered through the branches overhead with the soft voice of countless forgotten seasons. The father finally knelt beside the fallen trunk. Fresh pale wood shone beneath the broken bark. The scent filled the morning air, clean, sweet, almost comforting. He placed one rough hand upon the smooth timber. "This tree," he whispered, "will warm our family next winter." The boy nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand. A tree was never simply wood. It became warmth during cold nights. It became light when darkness filled the cabin. It became soup cooking above the fire. It became bread baking upon hot stones. It became comfort during heavy snowstorms. Every log carried tomorrow's warmth. Nothing inside the forest existed alone. Everything quietly served something else. The father reached for his axe once more. Not with excitement, not with anger, but with quiet gratitude. Because on the American frontier, even something as ordinary as firewood could mean another peaceful winter. The old oak tree rested peacefully upon the forest floor. For many decades, perhaps even longer, it had stood beneath the changing seasons. It had watched snow settle upon its branches. It had listened to spring birds build their nests. It had provided shade during warm summers. Now, its long life had quietly reached another purpose. The father placed the axe beside the fallen trunk. There would be no unnecessary chopping today, only enough wood for the coming week. Nothing more. The frontier had taught every family an important lesson. Take only what you need. Leave the rest for another season. The young boy knelt beside several broken branches. Some were no thicker than his thumb. Others required both hands to lift. Carefully, he gathered them into a small bundle. He tied them together with a simple rope made from twisted hemp fibers. The bundle looked rather untidy. Several sticks pointed in different directions. The father noticed, but he said nothing. Every skill required practice. Children learned through quiet repetition, not through criticism. A gentle breeze drifted through the towering pines. The highest branches whispered softly to one another. Sunlight slowly climbed higher into the sky. The morning mist had almost disappeared now. Only a few pale ribbons remained floating above the damp forest floor. Nearby, a family of rabbits quietly nibbled fresh grass beside an old fallen log. They seemed completely unafraid. The father smiled. When the forest is peaceful, the animals remain peaceful too. The boy looked toward the rabbits. They lifted their ears, watched for only a brief moment, then calmly returned to eating. The forest accepted quiet people. Loud people rarely belonged there. The father split several larger logs into manageable pieces. Each strike of the axe remained slow, steady, almost rhythmic. There was no wasted movement, no display of strength, only years of quiet experience. Soon, a neat stack of firewood began growing beside the fallen oak. The pale wood released a pleasant, fresh scent into the cool morning air. The boy picked up one log. It felt surprisingly heavy. He hugged it tightly against his chest. Step by careful step, he carried it toward the small wooden cart waiting beside the narrow forest path. The cart itself looked almost as old as the cabin. Its wooden wheels creaked gently whenever they turned. Iron bands surrounded each wheel. The wood had darkened after many rainy seasons, yet it remained dependable, like nearly everything upon the frontier. One log, then another, then another. The work continued quietly. Neither father nor son counted how many pieces they carried. There was no need. The cart would simply tell them when enough was enough. Above them, clouds drifted slowly across the bright blue sky. A hawk circled high above the forest. Far away, someone's distant cowbell echoed softly through the trees. Perhaps another family had begun their morning work. Perhaps another child was learning the same patient lessons. Life across the frontier often looked remarkably similar. Simple cabins, simple tools, simple hopes, simple days. When the cart had finally become half full, the father rested both hands upon its wooden side. He nodded once. "This is enough." The boy looked at the remaining wood. "There's still more." His father smiled kindly. "There will also be tomorrow." The boy thought quietly about those words. Tomorrow. The forest was not going anywhere. The trees would still be standing. The birds would still be singing. There would always be another morning. There would always be another quiet walk beneath the oaks. There would always be another chance to work patiently. Together, they slowly turned the cart toward home. The wheels rolled gently across the soft earth, leaving behind nothing except two narrow tracks that the next gentle rain would soon erase. The wooden cart rolled slowly into the clearing beside the cabin. Its wheels creaked softly over the uneven ground, leaving two faint tracks across the damp earth. The horse lowered its head, breathing quietly after the gentle journey home. The mother noticed them long before they reached the yard. She looked up from the small herb garden growing beside the cabin wall. Fresh parsley, sage, onions, and cabbage filled the narrow beds. These simple plants required constant care. Without them, even the plainest meals would become poorer during the long winter months. She smiled gently as the father stopped the cart beside the woodpile. No cheerful greeting was needed. They had lived together for many years. Small smiles often said more than many words. The young boy proudly untied his bundle of branches. Although the pile was small, he carried it with the same care as if it were enough to heat the cabin for an entire winter. His father noticed. Quiet pride filled his face. Every child learned by doing, never by watching alone. Together, they began unloading the cart. Large logs were stacked carefully against the back wall of the cabin. The father always arranged the wood in neat rows. He believed dry wood should breathe. Small spaces remained between each log so the wind could pass through. In time, the summer sun would dry every piece. Good firewood was never simply collected. It was prepared. The mother returned to her work. Using a bundle of dried twigs tied together with hemp cord, she swept the cabin floor. Small pieces of straw gathered near the doorway. Dust drifted through thin beams of sunlight entering from the open door. The family dog stretched lazily before following her outside. It wandered slowly around the yard, stopping now and then to investigate an interesting scent left by a rabbit during the night. Near the chicken coop, several hens scratched patiently through loose soil. A proud rooster stood upon an old fence post. Every few moments, it announced the morning once again, although the sun had already climbed well above the trees. The little girl carried 2 empty wooden buckets toward the nearby well. Each bucket seemed almost too large for her small hands. She walked carefully. Water spilled easily. Nothing should be wasted. The eldest son helped his father straighten the growing woodpile. Each log found its proper place. Some were thick enough for the coldest winter nights. Others would become kindling for cool autumn mornings. Nothing was stacked carelessly. Everything had its purpose. Above the cabin chimney, a thin ribbon of pale smoke drifted peacefully into the bright blue sky. The smell of burning oak spread gently across the clearing. Far beyond the trees, another chimney answered with its own quiet thread of smoke. Somewhere, another family was beginning another ordinary day. The frontier was wide, yet its people often lived remarkably similar lives. Simple cabins, simple gardens, simple meals, simple work. The father stepped back and quietly admired the finished woodpile. He placed one hand upon his son's shoulder. "Well done!" Only 2 words, yet the boy smiled more brightly than if he had received a chest full of silver coins. Sometimes, the greatest reward was simply knowing you had been useful. The quiet morning slowly became afternoon. The rhythm of work never hurried. The rhythm of work never stopped. It simply continued, one small task after another, just as it had yesterday, and just as it would tomorrow. By the time the firewood had been neatly stacked beside the cabin wall, the morning had quietly slipped toward midday. The sun climbed a little higher above the endless forest. Its warmth was gentle, not hot, not harsh, only enough to dry the morning dew that still lingered upon the grass. The father carried his axe back inside the cabin. Every tool had its place. The iron blade was carefully cleaned with an old piece of linen before being hung upon a sturdy wooden peg beside the doorway. A sharp tool deserved respect. A clean tool lasted longer. Nothing was left lying upon the ground. Nothing was forgotten. Outside, the mother walked slowly toward the small garden behind the cabin. It was not a large garden, perhaps no bigger than a single room inside the house. Yet nearly every meal depended upon it. Low wooden fences surrounded the small patch of earth, not to keep people out, but to persuade hungry rabbits and wandering deer to search elsewhere for their supper. The soil had already been turned many weeks before. Dark earth rested quietly beneath neat rows of growing vegetables. Young cabbage leaves stretched gently toward the sunlight. Small onions stood proudly beside them. Carrots remained hidden beneath the soil, revealing themselves only through delicate green leaves dancing softly in the breeze. Between the vegetables grew herbs, parsley, sage, thyme, mint. Each carried its own gentle fragrance. When the wind drifted across the garden, those scents quietly mixed together until the entire yard smelled fresh and comforting. The little girl followed her mother carrying a small woven basket. It was almost empty. Soon, it would hold the day's harvest. The mother knelt carefully beside a row of leafy greens. She never pulled the first plant she touched. Instead, she looked closely. Some plants still needed another week. Others had grown perfectly. Patience was as important in gardening as it was in chopping wood. The girl watched every movement. Her mother spoke softly. "The garden tells us when it is ready. We simply learn to listen." The child nodded. Although she did not fully understand, she believed every word. A butterfly drifted lazily across the garden. Its pale wings rose and fell without hurry. Nearby, a honeybee disappeared deep inside a tiny white flower before continuing its endless work from blossom to blossom. Neither insect seemed troubled by the quiet family. The mother carefully harvested several onions, then a handful of fresh herbs. Finally, a few tender cabbage leaves. Nothing more. Tomorrow, the garden would still be there, growing quietly beneath the sun. Near the corner of the fence stood a simple wooden scarecrow. Its faded hat leaned slightly to one side. Old linen sleeves fluttered gently whenever the breeze passed through the clearing. The youngest child looked at it every morning, and every morning he smiled. To him, the scarecrow looked almost like another silent member of the family. Beyond the garden, the endless forest surrounded the little homestead. Towering oak trees stood like ancient guardians. Tall white pines whispered quietly together high above the cabin roof. Birdsong drifted gently through the warm afternoon air. Far away, a woodpecker continued tapping against an old tree. The sound had become so familiar that nobody noticed it anymore. It simply belonged to the frontier. Just like the wind, just like the birds, just like the endless trees. The basket slowly became heavier, not because it was full, but because every small harvest represented another meal shared around the family's wooden table. The mother smiled softly. There would be enough soup for tonight, perhaps even enough vegetables left over for tomorrow. On the frontier, that was more than enough. By the time the little garden had been carefully tended, the sun stood quietly above the forest. It was neither early morning nor yet afternoon. It was that peaceful hour when the frontier seemed to pause. The birds no longer greeted the sunrise with excited songs. Instead, they settled into gentle conversations among the branches. The wind became softer. Even the chickens wandered more slowly across the yard. The mother looked inside the wooden water barrel beside the cabin door. Only a shallow layer remained, enough for perhaps one more meal. No more. She quietly picked up 2 wooden buckets. Their smooth handles had been polished by many years of careful hands. The older daughter immediately understood. Without a word, she walked toward her mother and accepted one of the buckets. Fetching water was not considered exciting work. It happened nearly every day, sometimes twice, sometimes even 3 times during the hottest weeks of summer. Water was life. Without it, there would be no soup simmering above the fire, no bread dough, no washing, no tea brewed from herbs gathered in the garden, no clean wooden bowls upon the family's table. The mother smiled softly. "Come." The little girl followed beside her. Together they left the cabin behind. A narrow footpath disappeared into the forest. The path had been walked so many times that even the grass no longer dared grow there. Tree roots crossed the trail like old fingers reaching through the earth. Small stones rested quietly beneath fallen leaves. Every step required patience. The mother never hurried. She knew every bend in the path, every ancient oak, every large moss-covered stone. The forest had become almost like another room of her home. Above them, towering white pines swayed gently in the breeze. Their needles whispered high overhead. Occasionally, a cone tumbled quietly onto the forest floor. The little girl stopped to pick one up. It fit neatly into her small hand. She smiled, then slipped it into the pocket of her apron. Perhaps she would show it to her younger brother later. Perhaps it would simply remain there until wash day. Simple treasures often brought the greatest happiness. The woodland became cooler as they walked deeper beneath the trees. Sunlight filtered through thousands of green leaves. Bright patches of light danced quietly upon the path. Tiny butterflies floated lazily between clusters of wildflowers. Blue, white, pale yellow. Nothing hurried, nothing struggled. The forest seemed content simply to exist. Soon, they heard it, a quiet trickling sound. Soft, steady, almost like whispered music. The woodland spring. It flowed gently from beneath a rocky hillside before wandering away through ferns and moss. The water looked perfectly clear. Smooth pebbles rested beneath its surface. Small fish darted between the shadows. The mother knelt carefully upon a flat stone. Before filling the buckets, she paused. She always paused. She watched the water for a moment. She listened. The spring looked exactly as it had yesterday, exactly as it had the week before. Its gentle voice never seemed to change. The little girl knelt beside her. She dipped one finger into the cold water. It felt wonderfully cool. The mother laughed quietly. "Cold enough?" The girl nodded. "Very cold." Together they lowered the buckets. The clear water rose slowly inside the smooth wooden pails. Tiny ripples spread across the spring before disappearing once again. Nearby, a robin landed upon a low branch. It watched the visitors without fear. Across the stream, a young deer stepped cautiously from the trees. It lowered its head and drank. Neither the family nor the deer disturbed one another. Both had come for exactly the same reason. The mother gently lifted her full bucket. Water shimmered inside. Not a single drop should be wasted. The journey home would require slow and careful steps. She looked once more at the little spring. Quiet, patient, faithful. It had served travelers long before the cabin had ever been built, and perhaps long after the cabin was gone. It would continue flowing through the forest, telling its quiet story to anyone willing to stop and listen. The woodland spring slowly disappeared behind the trees, step by careful step. The mother and her daughter followed the familiar footpath home. The wooden buckets were now filled almost to the top. The water shimmered gently whenever sunlight slipped through the leaves above. Neither of them hurried. A single careless step could spill precious water onto the forest floor. The mother had carried these same buckets along this path hundreds of times, perhaps thousands. She no longer counted. Some things simply became part of everyday life. Ahead, the cabin slowly appeared between the tall oak trees. A thin ribbon of pale smoke still drifted upward from the stone chimney. The familiar sight brought quiet comfort. Home never seemed large, it never seemed grand, yet it always felt welcoming. The family dog noticed them first. It lifted its head from beneath the shade of the porch. Its tail wagged slowly as it walked to greet them. The dog sniffed the buckets, finding nothing interesting inside except fresh water. It quietly returned to its favorite resting place. The father was already outside. He sat upon a low chopping block beside the neatly stacked firewood. A small pile of kindling rested beside his boots. With slow, practiced movements, he split another piece of oak into smaller sticks. Each strike of the axe was steady, never rushed, never wasted. The youngest boy carefully gathered the smaller pieces. He carried them one armful at a time toward the stone hearth inside the cabin. Each bundle looked slightly too large for him, yet he insisted on carrying every piece himself. The father watched without speaking. Some lessons needed no words. Inside the cabin, the air remained pleasantly cool, despite the growing warmth outside. Sunlight entered through the small round window above the sleeping bench. Its pale light rested softly upon the wooden table. The mother placed the heavy buckets beside the hearth. She poured fresh spring water into a large iron cooking pot. The clear water splashed gently against the dark metal. Soon, she added vegetables gathered from the garden that very morning. Fresh cabbage, a few onions, several carrots, a handful of fragrant herbs. Nothing expensive, nothing rare, only simple food grown through months of quiet work. She reached for a small cloth pouch hanging from a wooden peg. Inside rested coarse salt, a valuable treasure upon the frontier. Only a small pinch was needed. Too much would be wasteful. Too little would leave the soup dull. Experience guided her hand better than any measuring spoon. The iron pot was carefully lifted onto the sturdy hook above the glowing fire. Orange flames licked gently around the blackened bottom of the kettle. Soon, tiny bubbles appeared, then soft steam. The comforting smell slowly filled the cabin. The little girl stirred the soup using a long wooden spoon carved by her grandfather many years earlier. The smooth handle had grown darker with age. Generations of careful hands had held it before her. Outside, the chickens wandered freely across the yard. They scratched beneath old leaves. They searched patiently for seeds and insects. Occasionally, one discovered something worth celebrating. A quick cluck echoed across the clearing. Soon, every other chicken hurried over, only to discover there was almost nothing to share. The rooster observed everything with great importance. From the top of the low fence, he watched over the flock as though protecting an entire kingdom. Near the garden fence, the youngest child scattered a handful of dried grain. The chickens gathered immediately around his tiny boots. He laughed quietly. Their feathers brushed gently against his legs. One curious hen followed him even after the grain had disappeared. Perhaps it hoped another handful might appear. The father finally carried another bundle of oak wood inside. He placed it carefully beside the hearth. Enough for the afternoon, enough for the evening meal, enough until tomorrow morning. Nothing more was needed, nothing less. The soup continued to simmer. The herbs released their gentle fragrance into the warm cabin. Steam drifted slowly toward the heavy wooden beams above. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the old oak trees. A pair of doves landed quietly upon the cabin roof. Far beyond the clearing, the endless forest continued its patient silence. Inside the little cabin, there was no hurry, only the slow rhythm of ordinary life. A warm fire, fresh water, simple soup, family, and another peaceful day, passing almost unnoticed on the American frontier. The soup had been quietly simmering for nearly an hour. Tiny bubbles rose gently to the surface of the iron pot before disappearing once again beneath the fragrant broth. The cabin slowly filled with the comforting aroma of cabbage, sweet onions, fresh herbs, and warm wood smoke. Nothing smelled hurried. Nothing smelled extravagant, only the simple scent of a meal prepared with patience. The mother lifted the heavy iron lid. A cloud of warm steam drifted upward toward the dark wooden beams above. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed wrapped in the gentle fragrance of the afternoon meal. She tasted the broth with a small wooden spoon, only one careful sip. Then she smiled quietly. It was ready. The father washed his hands using cool spring water poured from a wooden bucket into a simple clay basin beside the doorway. The cold water carried away tiny pieces of bark, wood dust, and the scent of fresh oak. He dried his hands on a plain linen cloth hanging nearby. The children quietly gathered around the rough wooden table. There was no assigned seat. Everyone simply sat where they always had. The wooden benches creaked softly beneath their weight. The table itself had been built many years before. Its surface carried countless small marks left by knives, bowls, and years of ordinary family life. The mother carefully filled each clay bowl with steaming vegetable soup. Every serving looked almost the same. She always tried to divide everything equally. Fairness mattered, even when there was little to divide. Beside each bowl rested a thick slice of dark rye bread. Its crust remained firm, its center soft and warm. A small piece of fresh butter waited upon a wooden plate in the middle of the table. The family shared it carefully. No one took more than needed. Waste belonged to wealthier places. Not here. Before anyone lifted a spoon, the father quietly lowered his head. The others did the same. Outside, the breeze continued whispering through the tall pines. Inside, only silence remained. Thank you for today's bread. Thank you for today's harvest. Thank you for another peaceful day. Nothing more. The prayer lasted only a few moments, yet it carried great meaning. The meal began. No loud conversation filled the cabin, only the gentle sounds of wooden spoons touching clay bowls. The youngest boy blew carefully across his soup before taking the first sip. It was still too hot. His older sister smiled. She remembered doing exactly the same thing only a few years earlier. The father slowly spread a thin layer of butter across his bread. Every movement remained calm. There was nowhere else to be. Nothing demanded haste. Outside the open doorway, 3 hens wandered beneath the shade of a large oak tree. A curious rooster peered inside the cabin, as if wondering whether any crumbs might soon appear. The family dog rested quietly near the hearth. Its ears twitched whenever someone accidentally dropped a tiny piece of bread. Now and then, a grateful crumb found its way to the floor. The dog accepted each one as though it were a royal feast. Sunlight entered through the small round window. It slowly crossed the wooden floor, inch by inch, as the afternoon continued. Nobody noticed. Time moved differently here. It was measured not by clocks, but by sunlight, birdsong, and the steady rhythm of ordinary work. When every bowl had been emptied, the mother poured a little fresh spring water into each one. Nothing was allowed to dry against the clay. Clean bowls lasted longer. The children carried them outside one by one. The father remained seated for another quiet moment. He listened to the wind, to the birds, to the peaceful crackling of the fire. It was an ordinary meal, a simple meal, a forgettable meal, perhaps, to someone living in a busy city. But here, on the quiet American frontier, it was more than enough. The midday meal slowly came to an end. The last spoonful of warm vegetable soup disappeared from the clay bowls. The wooden table was wiped clean with a simple linen cloth. Nothing remained except the faint aroma of herbs and fresh bread lingering in the quiet cabin. Outside, the afternoon had settled gently across the frontier. The wind had grown softer. The forest no longer echoed with the energetic songs of the morning birds. Instead, everything seemed wrapped in a pleasant stillness. It was the quietest part of the day. The father carried a small wooden stool into the shade beside the cabin. He did not intend to work very hard. The morning had already provided enough labor. Instead, he wished to repair a few simple tools before another season wore them down completely. Beside him rested an old wooden toolbox. Inside were only a handful of possessions: a small carving knife, an iron awl, a whetstone, a wooden mallet, several hand-forged nails, a bundle of leather strips, nothing more. Yet every one of these simple tools helped keep the little homestead alive. He picked up the handle of a worn garden hoe. Years of steady work had polished the wood until it felt almost silky beneath his hands. Near the end, a small crack had begun to appear. It was not dangerous. Not yet. But the father knew something important. Small problems always became larger if ignored. Carefully, he wrapped the cracked handle with a damp strip of leather. Slowly, he tightened it, then secured it with tiny wooden pegs. The repair looked simple, but it would probably last another year. Across the yard, the mother sat beneath the open doorway where cool air drifted through the cabin. Afternoon sunlight rested softly across her lap. She unfolded a thick wool blanket. Several tiny holes had appeared after many winters. Nothing unusual. Blankets worked hard on the frontier. They warmed sleeping children, covered tired shoulders, protected food during cold nights. Sometimes, they even served as winter coats. Throwing it away never entered her thoughts. Instead, she reached for a small wooden sewing box. Inside lay neatly rolled linen thread, several iron needles, tiny bone buttons, a silver thimble inherited from her own mother many years before. She threaded the needle carefully. Her hands moved without hesitation. Thousands of stitches had taught them exactly what to do. The eldest daughter sat quietly beside her. She held another piece of worn clothing, a simple linen shirt belonging to her younger brother. One sleeve had torn while climbing the old oak tree several days earlier. The girl smiled quietly as she remembered his embarrassed face. The tear itself was small. Only a few careful stitches would make it disappear. The mother spoke softly. "Every stitch saves another day." The daughter nodded. She had heard those words many times before. Still, they never sounded old. Nearby, the youngest boy sat cross-legged beneath the shade of the porch. In his hands rested a tiny wooden horse. His father had carved it during the previous winter, using leftover pieces of oak. The wheels did not turn very well. The legs looked too short. The head leaned slightly to one side. Yet to the little boy, it was the finest toy in all the colonies. He slowly pushed it across the dusty ground, making no sound, only watching it travel through imaginary fields and forests. The family dog watched him for a few moments, then stretched lazily and returned to sleep. Even the chickens had grown sleepy. Several hens rested beneath the herb garden fence. One fluffed its feathers before closing its eyes. Only the old rooster remained awake, standing proudly upon the fence post, watching over his peaceful kingdom. Far above, white clouds drifted slowly across the bright blue sky. A pair of swallows circled above the cabin roof. Their graceful flight hardly disturbed the quiet afternoon. The father finished repairing the hoe. He placed it neatly against the cabin wall, then reached for another tool, not because it was urgently needed, but because peaceful afternoons were perfect for small acts of care. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was neglected. Every repaired blanket, every sharpened blade, every patched shirt, every mended handle, helped the family welcome another season. Life on the frontier was rarely built by grand moments. Instead, it was quietly stitched together, one careful repair at a time. The quiet afternoon drifted gently toward evening. The bright sunlight that had warmed the cabin since morning slowly became softer. Long shadows stretched across the clearing. The great oak trees seemed even taller now. The forest no longer bustled with the small sounds of daytime. Instead, everything appeared calmer, slower, sleepier. The mother stepped inside the cabin and opened a heavy wooden chest. Inside were several linen sacks. Each one held something precious: dried beans, cornmeal, rye flour, a little barley. Nothing was stored carelessly. Every sack had been folded tightly against insects and damp air. She reached for the smallest sack: rye flour. Only enough remained for 2 more loaves of bread. She smiled softly. That would be enough. Bread did not need to be plentiful. It only needed to last. She carried the sack to the broad wooden table standing beneath the small round window. Afternoon sunlight rested gently across its worn surface. The table had served the family for many years. Its edges had become smooth beneath countless hard-working hands. She placed a large wooden bowl in the center. Slowly, she poured the dark rye flour into it. The powder settled like soft brown snow. Next came a pinch of coarse salt, a little warm spring water. Finally, she reached toward a small clay jar. Inside rested yesterday's sourdough starter. The living mixture had been carefully protected for months, perhaps even years. Every loaf carried a little piece of the one baked before it. The mother stirred everything together with a thick wooden spoon, round and round, slowly, patiently. Nothing in bread making could ever be rushed. Outside, the father quietly sharpened his iron axe upon a smooth whetstone. The steady scraping sound blended gently with birds singing in the distance. The oldest daughter entered the cabin carrying a small bundle of dry firewood. She placed it beside the stone hearth without speaking. She already knew what her mother would need. Soon, the spoon became too heavy. The mother placed it aside. Now came the real work. She pressed both hands into the dough. Fold, press, turn, fold again. The soft mixture slowly became smooth beneath her fingers. The little boy climbed onto a wooden stool beside the table. His eyes followed every movement. He loved watching the dough change. At first, it looked messy, sticky, uneven. Then, little by little, it became something beautiful. The mother smiled. "Would you like to help?" The boy nodded immediately. She tore away a tiny piece of dough. He pressed both hands against it with all his strength. The dough flattened awkwardly. One side became much thicker than the other. The mother laughed quietly. "It looks wonderful." The boy smiled proudly. He believed her completely. Nearby, the family cat quietly jumped onto the bench. Its nose twitched curiously. Fresh dough carried an interesting smell. Not meat, not fish, but something comforting, something familiar. The mother gently lifted the cat back onto the floor. The cat accepted the decision without complaint. Instead, it curled beside the warm hearth and closed its eyes. The large bowl was covered with a clean linen cloth. Now, the dough needed time, perhaps an hour, perhaps longer. Good bread decided for itself when it was ready. Nobody argued with bread. The family returned to their quiet afternoon. The father continued sharpening tools. The daughter folded clean laundry. The younger children played quietly beneath the old oak tree. Inside the bowl, hidden beneath the linen cloth, the dough slowly came alive. Tiny bubbles formed deep inside, almost invisible, almost silent. The bread was growing, patiently, quietly, exactly as it had for generations. The afternoon slowly surrendered to the quiet arrival of evening. The bright light that had filled the little clearing all day began to soften. Golden sunlight slipped through the tall white pines, stretching long shadows across the grass. Nothing changed quickly on the frontier. Even the setting sun seemed in no hurry. Inside the cabin, the large wooden bowl rested peacefully beneath its clean linen cloth. No one disturbed it. The dough was doing its quiet work, slowly, patiently, almost invisibly. The mother lifted one corner of the cloth just enough to take a careful look. She smiled. The smooth round dough had grown larger than before. Tiny pockets of air had formed beneath its soft surface. It seemed almost alive. She gently covered it once again. "Not yet," she whispered. "Just a little longer." No one else heard her words. Perhaps she was speaking to the bread. Perhaps she was simply speaking to herself. Outside, the father carried another small bundle of dry oak into the cabin. He selected each piece carefully. Bread required steady heat, not roaring flames, not smoking embers, only patient fire. He arranged the logs inside the stone hearth with quiet precision. The largest pieces rested at the bottom. Smaller branches crossed above them. A handful of dry pine needles waited nearby. Every piece had its purpose. Nothing was placed by chance. The eldest son watched carefully. He knew this was another lesson. Fire could warm a family. Fire could bake bread. Fire could also destroy everything. Respect always came before comfort. The father struck a piece of flint against hardened steel. A tiny spark leapt into a nest of dried moss. For a brief moment, almost nothing happened. Then, a thin ribbon of pale smoke curled upward. A tiny orange glow appeared. The father leaned closer. He breathed softly, not hard, not fast, only enough to encourage the little flame. Soon, the pine needles caught, then the smallest twigs. Finally, the larger oak logs began to burn. The fire never rushed. It simply grew, exactly as every evening before. Across the yard, the youngest children sat beneath the old oak tree. They collected smooth stones from the edge of the path. One by one, they arranged them into tiny circles, then little walls, then imaginary houses. No expensive toys, no painted blocks, only stones, sticks, and imagination. A robin landed nearby, tilting its head curiously. The children smiled. The bird seemed almost interested in joining their little village. But after a few quiet moments, it fluttered away toward the forest. The family dog wandered slowly across the clearing. It stopped beside the woodpile, then beneath the wagon. Finally, it settled upon its favorite patch of warm earth where the afternoon sun still lingered. Its eyes closed almost immediately. Even the animals understood that evening had begun. The mother uncovered the dough once again. This time, it was ready. She pressed one finger gently into its surface. The small dent slowly rose again. Perfect. She sprinkled a little rye flour across the broad wooden table, then carefully turned the dough onto its surface. It landed with a soft whisper. Using both hands, she shaped it into 2 round loaves. Not perfectly round, not perfectly smooth. Each loaf carried the marks of careful hands. The eldest daughter placed 2 flat wooden boards beside the hearth. A clean linen cloth covered each one. The fresh loaves rested quietly upon them. For a few final moments, They would rise once more before entering the oven. Outside, the sunlight continued fading. The western sky glowed with soft shades of amber, gold, and pale rose. High above the forest, a flock of geese crossed the evening sky. Their distant calls drifted softly across the valley. The father stood outside the cabin for a moment. He looked toward the endless forest. The trees had protected his family all day. Now, they prepared to welcome another peaceful night. He took one slow breath of cool evening air. The smell of fresh bread, burning oak, and pine trees blended together. It was a simple fragrance, yet to him, it smelled exactly like home. The last warmth of the afternoon lingered gently across the little clearing. Long shadows stretched from the great oak trees, reaching slowly toward the cabin like quiet hands. The forest seemed to breathe more slowly now. The cheerful songs of morning birds had faded into occasional calls from robins and thrushes preparing for the evening. A cool breeze wandered through the white pines. Their tall branches whispered softly above the roof. Inside the cabin, everything felt warm. The fire beneath the stone hearth had burned steadily for nearly an hour. The father had built it carefully, not too hot, not too weak, exactly the way his own father had once taught him. He knelt beside the hearth and moved several glowing oak embers deeper into the old brick baking oven. Using a long wooden peel, he gently spread the heat across the stone floor. The inside of the oven glowed with a quiet orange light. It had taken patience to prepare. Good bread never welcomed hurried fire. The mother uncovered the 2 round loaves resting beneath their linen cloth. They had grown beautifully. Their smooth tops had become soft and full of tiny pockets of air. She pressed one finger lightly against the nearest loaf. The dough slowly returned to its shape. Perfect. She smiled without saying a word. Her hands dusted each loaf with a little rye flour. The pale powder settled gently across the dark surface. Then, using a small iron knife, she made one simple cut across the top of each loaf. Not for decoration. The bread needed room to breathe while baking. The eldest daughter watched every movement. One day, these hands would become hers. Recipes were never written down inside this little cabin. They passed quietly from mother to daughter, season after season, year after year. The father stepped aside. The mother lifted the first loaf onto the long wooden peel. Its smooth surface caught the warm glow of the fire. Slowly, carefully, she slid it into the waiting oven. Then the second. The heavy wooden door closed with a gentle thump. Now, there was nothing to do but wait. Bread always kept its own time. Outside, the youngest boy sat upon an old tree stump. A handful of acorns rested beside him. He arranged them into little circles upon the ground. Each acorn became part of an imaginary village. Tiny sticks became fences. Flat stones became houses. The little girl gathered bright autumn leaves fallen beneath the great oak tree. Golden leaves, rust-colored leaves, deep red leaves. She tucked them carefully into her apron pocket. Perhaps she would press them inside her Bible later. Or perhaps she simply liked carrying beautiful things home. Near the chicken coop, the hens had begun returning one by one. They scratched the ground a final time before hopping quietly onto their wooden roosts. The proud rooster remained outside just a little longer, watching everything, guarding everyone. Evening always belonged to him. The family dog slowly wandered toward the cabin porch. It circled twice upon the worn wooden boards before lying down. Its tired eyes remained fixed upon the open doorway. The familiar smell of fresh bread drifted outside. Warm, earthy, comforting. Even the dog seemed to recognize it. Far above, a small flock of geese crossed the fading sky. Their distant calls echoed softly across the valley. The father looked upward for only a moment. "They'll be heading south," he spoke almost to himself. The eldest son followed the birds until they disappeared beyond the forest. He wondered how far they would travel, farther than he could imagine. Yet every autumn, they always returned. The cabin grew quieter. No one hurried to open the oven. Fresh bread demanded patience. If opened too soon, the crust would never become perfect. The mother simply sat beside the hearth. Her hands rested peacefully in her lap. She listened. Tiny crackles from the fire, gentle bubbling inside the oven, the wind brushing against the cabin walls, a distant owl calling from deep within the forest. These were the sounds of evening, the sounds she had known for almost her entire life. Simple sounds, quiet sounds, the kind of sounds that slowly settled the mind and invited the long frontier day to come gently to its peaceful end.